Coogs House. This round of college realignment began with the Houston Cougars making the move into the Power 5 and continues to see teams like Houston stuck right in the middle of the story. Let's jump on into it.
You are Locked On Cougs, your daily podcast on the Houston Cougars, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to Locked On Cougs, the daily podcast about your Houston Cougars. I'm your host, Houston-born teacher and coach Parker Ainsworth, here to break down all things Cougs. If you're a U of H fan or just a hater who came to stop by, please be sure to subscribe down below. That way you can listen to Cougs in your newsfeed each and every day. Appreciate you making Locked On Cougs your first listen of the day. And welcome back to the YouTube channel. As you've seen on social media, I'm sure. Remember, if we get to 2,000 subscribers by TCU week, or by the TCU game, I should say, we'll be giving away a free jersey that with the Big 12 logo on it, right? I guess it's over here, to kick off Big 12 football season officially for the University of Houston. All Big 12 talk today, so be ready for it. If you want to help us get there, make sure to subscribe. Remember, at 1,500, we're also going to give away a hat for what it's worth. At 1,500, we're going to give away those, so make sure you hit subscribe to get us there. And like and comment on the video to let us know you're in the contest. If you're tired of talking about the Big 12 and you're all Big 12'd out, down below, tell us what your order at Whataburger is. All right, so today we're going to talk some about the Big 12 chaos that happened over the weekend / late Friday. I'm going to go back to start kind of at the beginning of it. I'll talk about how Houston plays into said chaos of the new Big 12/16 conference. We're then going to jump into kind of talking about, is this good or bad for college football and then college sports? Because that was kind of the secondary discussion after the news came out all weekend long. And I think we both have Houston lenses on this, but I hope we agree that on that one, because I think there's some very specific takes out there. But first, let's get into the rundown of what exactly happened, because again, this did somewhat start with Houston. We got to also make sure we go all the way back to just 18 months ago, not even that long ago. But Texas and Oklahoma said they were leaving the Big 12 shortly after, or I guess around the same time as Yormark coming in charge of the conference. And Brett Yormark then had to find a way to save the Big 12. Right? The Big 12 was never going to make it with 8 teams and losing marquee brands like Texas and Oklahoma. If you go far enough back, you remember the Big 12 was in similar jeopardy in the 2011, 12, 13 windows of the world, right? When it looked like the Pac-12 was going to, ironically, the Pac-12 was going to come in and steal some of these Big 12 teams and make a Pac-12 East to play the Pac-12 West and so on through TV deal money, right? Now, it's no secret that Texas has been looking for the biggest way to make money since then. They made a Longhorn Network for the same kinds of reasons, right? That was part of that deal, was that they'd get to make the Pac-12 network. But then recently, Texas and Oklahoma decided they're going into the SEC. Bigger TV contracts in the SEC. The SEC and the Big Ten still have the largest TV contracts for the foreseeable future. But for what it's worth, they said they were going to go, and Brett Yormark had to save the Big 12. He had to find some way to make this conference manage and survive, and that's where Houston comes in. Houston, Cincinnati, Central Florida, and BYU, for various reasons, I would argue, fan base and the scope, location being Houston specific, but also just history of football program. Houston has done things like they played Texas Tech in several close games. They beat Oklahoma, right? They've played Big 12 caliber teams in the last decade, not to mention beating teams like, Florida State here or Auburn and the Chick-fil-A Peach Bowl, and Auburn, the Birmingham Bowl, FCU in the Peach Bowl. Anyway, you get me. They've beaten Power 5 teams where they look like they can play the part. Cincinnati was on the verge of and then made a college football playoff, right? Central Florida went undefeated in 2017 and claimed their own national championship. So those kinds of teams were who Brett Yormark went to go get from the group of 5 and build a 12-team conference. And this season, we have a 14-team conference, as it's kind of that in-between year where the Texas and Oklahoma schools, or Texas and Oklahoma, are still here, and then the 4 new schools are coming in, and then next season it'll just be back down to 12, we thought. Then a few weeks back, I guess I should go further back than that, Brett Yormark, with that new landscape in mind, navigated a very profitable TV deal with Fox and ESPN in combination, with a pro rata for, at the time, as he saw fit. But the Big 12 school presidents said 16 teams. He could go as many Power 5 type of teams could come into the conference and get the same $31.7 million minimum media deal starting in the 2025-26 school year, right? So it starts the summer of 2025. Now, with all of that said, I'm running that really, really fast. What that meant is that the Big 12 was, quote, open for business. Brett Yormark said as much. They could go get more schools, and those schools would get the exact same amount. It wasn't redividing up the same pie. It was adding in slices, right? And as long as those schools were Power 5 schools, or that they could sell to ESPN and Fox that they were Power 5 schools, it worked, right? And so that's been the case for the last 18 months, right? Is that Brett Yormark has been flirting with other schools, and there's been rumors, and some people like Swaim or Shear or different people online have been very, very accurate in some of the stuff, but it was all rumors. It was, I heard from so-and-so, heard from so-and-so, that was in such and such meeting that this is being said, right? Because all these schools are doing their due diligence to make sure they're going to make the most money on their TV deals. And 31.7 as a minimum is a lot, right? Currently, that lands them square up with the ACC. And then when you factor in the escalators on things like bowl appearances, so when Houston makes a big bowl game next year, everyone in the conference gets paid. When Houston makes the college football playoff, if not next year that you're at, right, then everyone in the conference gets paid. When a bunch of teams in the Big 12 make the March Madness tournament, because they will, it's the best conference ever assembled in college basketball, a bunch of teams get paid from that too, right? And so all those different units can get added to this deal. You're looking at closer to $50 million a year, right? Now, it's not quite Big Ten or SEC money, but the savviness of Brett Yormark is that the deal is up. It starts in 2025 and it's just up in 2031, meaning they're back at the negotiating table very, very quickly. And you can see the deal get even closer to Big Ten and SEC caliber by then. Whew. Okay, so that's how the Big 12 happened. That's where we're at. Until about 10 days ago, Colorado, after having made their own splash and getting Deion Sanders and some of the transport and stuff like that, was waiting for the Pac-12 to come up with their own TV deal. Remember, Colorado was in the Big 12 before the last round of realignment stuff in 2010, 11, 12, right? And so Colorado got tired of waiting for the deal to show up from the Pac-12 that never came. And Colorado jumped before the deal was ever put out there, which, for what it's worth, did take some bravery, right? Like they theoretically, the Pac-12 could have had some mega deal come and they would have already left. But Colorado, because there was no deal in place, then thus no guarantee, grant of rights, they don't have to pay an exit fee to get out of the Pac-12. They jumped on board with the Big 12. Deion likes Texas. It's, a match made in heaven. It's frankly geographically makes more sense. They were in the Big 12 before, right? Those things all make a ton of sense. So Colorado comes over. Then the Pac-12, which if you go further back, also lost USC and UCLA in the summer of 22 to the Big Ten. That starts next season, right? But in their same TV deal, things a lot like the Big 12 losing Texas and Oklahoma, the Pac-12 lost USC and UCLA to the Big Ten for a big payday. Should point out, for the big payday. The Pac-12 was down to 9 teams starting in 2025, or starting in 2024, actually, I'm sorry, 2024-25 school year. And suddenly they needed to figure something out. And their TV deal with the big brands like the LA schools and now Deion Sanders leaving looked like it was going to continue to fall. And people started getting worried. That's where the rumors really, really amplified. Then you get to fast forward to last week when George Kliavkoff finally presents a TV deal to his partners that is heavy based in streaming, meaning to watch their games, you'll have to subscribe to, in this case, Apple TV. Now, Apple TV is not uncommon. Streaming is the wave of the future, but in the present tense, your main cable network television is still how the vast, vast majority of people watch college sports. Admittedly, the younger demographics watch more streaming, which would project to like many years from now, at maybe 10, maybe as soon as 10, you could see how that's the better deal. However, in the present tense, it's still overwhelmingly leaning towards people that watch cable television. That did not sit well with people in the Pac-12. And so by the end of the week, you had Arizona first decided that they were going to jump ship. Early in the summer, Arizona had been told that they and Arizona State did not have to move together, but with the Pac-12 being down to 9 teams and then Arizona deciding to jump ship and make it 8 teams, suddenly the Pac-12 was in trouble and people started talking. Now, Arizona had not quite formalized their leave yet, but they were going to. And so the state of Arizona, as public school, told Arizona and Arizona State they had to move together, or at least entertain the idea of moving together. So Arizona State started talking. Then the Big 12 apparently reached out to Oregon and Washington, and they started talking and talking and talking. So suddenly you're talking about a lot of Pac-12 schools coming to the Big 12. Now, Oregon and Washington took a bigger deal to get to the Big 10, even though they are getting not quite a full Big 10 share for the first couple years. It looks like at least the first year, potentially the first 2 years, and that's all that's been reported. I know I have people on Twitter that like to argue with me, but they don't read the fine print. That's all that's being reported as far as how many years they'll be making less than the average Big 10 school. That is more than the average Pac-12 school would have made, and for what it's worth, after escalators may end up being more than what the average Big 12 school will make. We'll see, right? So they jump ship to the Big 10, both of them together. Then you have Arizona State officially decide that they're going to leave with Arizona because the Pac-12 is crumbling, and Utah scrambles and realizes their best bet is the Big 12 as well. Now, they had an offer extended. I don't mean to say that, but it sounds like Utah was kind of the last domino to fall. So by Friday evening, you had a Big 12 that starting in 2024 will be 16 teams, a Pac-12 that will be starting in 2024 currently, as this recording is happening, just 4 teams. And as things move forward, you have Washington and Oregon in the same conference as Rutgers and Penn State. You have Arizona and Arizona State in the same conference as Central Florida and West Virginia, both the Big 10 and the Big 12, as conferences with much more than 10 and 12 teams go from coast to coast. Now, that led to a lot of people spending the weekend talking about how this was bad for college football and blah, 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 and all those kinds of things. And I think it's worth pointing out that this all started with Houston saving the Big 12 by being one of the 4 teams that came in, because that saved the Big 12. And that it's not actually that bad for the Big 12. It's just, or for college football, it's just bad for a handful of programs. But first, we need to talk about LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs is a great place to add to your team. If you're going to add to your team of 12 and get up 16 like the Big 12 just did, that's really, really important for your team. And these days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps find the right people for your team faster and for free. Again, if you can add schools that are in the Power 5 conference or add people that are Power 5 caliber to your team, you need to do it. You need to do it at LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs, that you find the qualified candidates you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. It's linkedin.com/LockedOnCollege. Post your job for free. Terms and conditions do apply. All right. So as it stands, there are 16 teams in the Big 12. There are a lot of teams in the Big 10. There are 4 teams in the Pac-12. And I, again, would reiterate, this centers on schools like Houston taking the hand and stepping up to help out the Big 12 and keep it alive, right? This does not work if the Big 12 does not stay alive. Big 12 does not stay alive without schools like Houston stepping up. Now, the talk all weekend was looking at, is this good for college football? Is losing potentially a rivalry like Oregon State happening every year good for college football? Now, I will say that for what it's worth in that specific instance, both schools have said that as soon as they're able to get the game going, they will play. I think it's just interesting that was a question in the first place. It was not a question 12 years ago when A&M went to the SEC and people decided that A&M and Texas were just never going to play each other again in football. When Kansas and Missouri split up and Missouri went to the SEC, people didn't decide to just question if Kansas and Missouri should be playing each other in basketball and football and things like that again. That didn't happen. When Utah went to the Pac-12, no one questioned if they should make sure they got to play BYU every year in the Holy War. They didn't. So now that Oregon State and Oregon are splitting up, we got to talk about, well, is this good for college football? Why wasn't it good for college football then? Or why was it? Why does that matter? Why is this suddenly a bigger discussion than it has been? Right now, that's not to say that there weren't folks in Austin or College Station, although College Station's small, but that were talking about, well, I wish we got, I'm sure there were plenty of people in both places that wanted to be playing one another. I'm not saying there weren't. I am saying the national discussion, the ESPN leading headline, is this good for college football, was not the case. I remember watching it, right? That's not what people were talking about then. And now, for what it's worth, you've actually brought back a handful of rivalries, right? Utah and BYU are back in the same conference. That's important. Texas and Texas A&M are back in the same conference. That seems important. For what it's worth, we've also reintroduced Houston into the Big 12. And this is where you and I start agreeing, I believe. Houston got left out of this whole big picture and lost all of their rivalries, all of them, in the mid-90s. That was not considered bad for college football. No one threw a big hissy fit and outside of Houston and led a bunch of sports pages with how could the Houston Cougars get left out like this. We know Ian Richards left Houston out, that all those things happened, right? But back when the Southwest Conference got cut in half and half joined the Big 8 to make the Big 12, and the other half got left behind, Houston and Rice and TCU, the schools got left behind. And it wasn't bad for college football then. College football did very well since then. Rivalries have come and gone since then. And suddenly it's bad for college football when Oregon and Oregon State don't necessarily have to play one another. Meanwhile, West Virginia joined the Big 12 and back in 2012. They had a few years there where they couldn't play Pitt because of the predetermined non-conference schedules out ahead of time. And they've managed to play Pitt every single year since. Once they got them back on the schedule, it's going to play them every single year. When you want the rivalry to happen, it can continue to happen. Same thing happened with Clemson and South Carolina. They're not in the same conference. That rivalry has lasted forever. I don't think that this college football. No, if you want it to happen, if your university wants it to happen, as Oregon and Oregon State have already said it will do, it will happen. Never mind that USC and UCLA left to go to the Big Ten together. Arizona State joined the Big 12 together. These things happen, right? The rivalries move. Now, Oklahoma and Oklahoma State and Bedlam and all that. We heard Mike Gundy, I'm sure Locked and Oklahoma State talked about it a lot more, and Locked the Sooners probably did too. But Mike Gundy alluded to that it's their fault that they left and blah, blah, blah. But if the schools wanted to play each other, they'd set that up. There are plenty of Big 12 schools playing SEC schools in their non-conference. It happens, right? If you want to set it up, you can set it up and you can get it done. And frankly, it behooves you to get it done because it's a big, high-dollar non-conference game to get done. I said to say that I think my frustration is not that there's potential for the rivalries to get lost. It's that, A, it ignores that there could be completely new ones in college football, right? Oregon and Ohio State could be a lot of fun, right? Like that could be a lot of fun in a way that worth pointing out, right? Houston and Baylor. I mean, Drake and I going back and forth on Twitter, but that could be a lot of fun for the foreseeable future because Baylor got in the Big 12 a long time ago, but right, that can be a lot of fun, right? Texas A&M and Texas is back. That's back on the schedule. That could be a lot of fun, right? Texas and LSU. They played a couple years ago in the Joey Burrow days, right? Like that could be a lot of fun. That could be back, right? This does not have to be the end of things that the schools do not want it to be. But like when Texas and Texas A&M stopped playing each other, it kind of felt like us because the schools wanted it to be. Texas was not going to go play A&M out of conference. It didn't have to. A&M wasn't going to go play Texas out of conference. It didn't have to. Frankly, it probably behooved both schools to not take that out, whichever one took it that year, right? I don't know if Oregon State feel the same way about it or if they'll keep the rivalry going. But I will say that there are enough evidence or enough schools that serve as evidence that you can keep these things going if you want to. That to me, I don't see that as a reason in college football specifically to keep this from happening. Now, admittedly, that's because Houston got left of this thing a long time ago. I opened with this segment with that. I'm sticking with Houston lost all of their rivalries back in the mid-90s. They stopped playing Texas. They stopped getting to play Oklahoma. Big 8 didn't play that often. They stopped playing Arkansas. They stopped playing Baylor. Right? Those things hurt Houston and hurt Houston for a long, long time. And now that Houston's clawed their way back in, I don't want to hear crap about why that's bad for college football. They're here. It's their turn. Our rivalries are back on. I'm sorry yours may end if your president doesn't see it or AD doesn't see it as a necessary thing to happen. We got in, right? And TCU and Utah created their own rivalry in the Mountain West Conference after the Southwest Conference fell apart. That rivalry's brought back together now in this whole madness, right? BYU and Utah lost their rivalry when BYU went independent and Utah went to the Pac-12. That rivalry's back on now, right? These things can come and go. And again, you can get new ones. right? Like Houston and Memphis would have had nothing to do with one another had not been for the American Athletic Conference, or CUSA first, I guess. And then they did, right? Suddenly these things can spark up out of nowhere. Like Houston and Memphis still hate each other online. Go check it out. I block several Memphis accounts for responding to crap daily. Just you're not in the Big 12. Don't talk to me. Right? These things can come and go. These things, when they go, don't have to be gone forever. And if it's important enough to your university, they'll figure out a way to make it work, or they'll scrap and claw and get their way back into that conference and get their way back into those rivalries over the course of a couple of decades, as we saw with Houston. Now, that's not to say it's the same in every sport. And so in the third segment, I do want to take a moment to look at how this impacts. Now, this might negatively impact other sports. So let's just jump on it. Over the weekend, after this happened on Friday evening, the things that went viral were that several Washington softball players commented that now they will play one school in the Pacific Northwest and no other schools close to home, right? And they are saying like they're going to play a 3-game road trip in Rutgers because it's in their conference, right? And that they had like done, and some of them were commenting that like they'd signed up to go to Washington because it was close to home. And most of the teams they played, Washington State, Oregon State, at least the top north half of the Pac-12, were relatively close to home, certainly drivable, right? And so their families could come see them play without having to fly across the country and do all that kind of chaos, right? Admittedly, sports like baseball and softball and volleyball, men's basketball typically make enough revenue. Men's basketball teams typically make enough revenue to cover themselves, but women's basketball doesn't always, as far as the revenue aspect of it goes. I say to say that there are sports that this makes less and less sense for. It does make less and less sense if you start looking at USC is going to fly all the way across the country to play Ohio State in track or in a track meet, or to play, Iowa in 3 baseball games, those things can make less and less sense. Football does drive these things. Football is the moneymaker, is the revenue, and at most universities, the football program makes enough money to pay for all the other sports. And I don't mean to say that's the way it should be, or that we shouldn't find some way to better distribute that money, because for what it's worth, the schools don't pay the kids, right? But I digress, right? At the end of the day, the reason that drives these decisions is because the football team brings in the money and everyone else ends up having to live with those decisions. I do think 2 things about this. One, I think we're increasingly heading towards a world where you have a football conference and a non-football conference, right? Frankly, the Big 12 was already talking about that and may end up doing that before this is all said and done with Gonzaga and UConn, who are non-football. I mean, I guess UConn has football, but it's not a revenue sport at that school by any stretch, right? But UConn and Gonzaga both hang their hat and make their money playing college basketball. And the Big 12 is the best conference in college basketball head to toe. It's no questions asked. So suddenly, they see the Big 12 forming and think, can we get in that game? We'll see, right? The redistribution of the revenue may be different for those 2 schools because they don't have football. But the Big 12 is certainly not saying a hard no yet. You're seeing it with schools like Notre Dame playing all of their sports except for football in the ACC. And then in football, they have their own independent schedule, right? Frankly, BYU functioned fairly similarly. They just had a fully independent schedule, but fairly similarly across sports for the last however many years as well, right? I don't think it's that crazy to think that we are heading towards a world where Houston can be in the Big 12 in football, or the Big 20, or whatever they call it by the time it's all said and done in football, but playing a glorified old-fashioned Southwest Conference and most other things, right? I don't think that takes that much creativity. I also don't I don't think it's a bad idea. Football naturally leans itself into traveling big distances for a single game, right? A football season's 12 games long. A regular season is 12 games long. You play half those at home, half those on the road. You're talking about a total of 6 games. Once you get on a plane's kind of a plane, right? So if you're getting on a plane from Houston, if you get on a plane from Hobby and you get on the plane and jump over to Memphis, it's not a whole lot different experience than getting on a plane and jumping over to Columbus or I'm going to plan heading over to Eugene, or I'm planning jumping over to Lubbock, or I'm planning jumping over to like. It's not a whole lot different from your plane ride perspective. I think a big thing of Houston's schedule this year, and one thing that's benefits them is having so many games in the state of Texas. But we both know that Texas is so gargantuan that you're still going to probably fly to Lubbock. And frankly, it's not the worst idea to fly to and from Fort Worth. The other thing about this for the kids' mental health perspective on these trips is that the games are by and large on Saturdays. So even if you want to stay an extra night, you fly out Friday, play on Saturday, fly back Sunday. That's a weekend, right? That's the 6 road weekends for you in the football season, right? Is it somewhat more professional than the old Southwest Conference was? Yeah. Is it the end of the world, and is it totally conceivable for college football? It's absolutely conceivable for college football. And it makes a lot of sense for college football. It just doesn't make a lot of sense for that UW softball team to play a road trip where they have to play 3 games in Rutgers and 3 games in Michigan and 3 games in Michigan State and 3 games in Ohio State. Like suddenly, yeah, I mean, Iowa and Minnesota, like those things can make a lot less sense. It makes some sense to have separate conferences of football and other sports. And frankly, I think Brett Yormark sees it too. And this is the fun part. He's already alluded to having different media deals in basketball and football when it's time to re-up this in 2031, because he thinks by the time we get to that, you'll have a higher price point on things like college basketball. And he knows Big 12 is going to be the best basketball conference in America, right? He sees that. He's marketing that such. We're playing a game in Mexico next year in 2020, winter 24, right? So next calendar year. If you're going to do 2 TV deals, why can't they have different teams on them? Right? Like, why does they have to have the same set of teams on the 2 different TV deals if they're already 2 different TV deals? That's the first thought I have, that you're leading into very quickly. And I don't think there's a problem with having different conferences in football and everything else. The second thing I'll say is, and this I think is where I've disagreed with a lot of colleagues online as far as people do sports commentary and sports content and that kind of stuff. It is totally okay and totally human to be excited about the Big 12 and the Big 16 and the future of college football in this conference, and the future of college football for Oregon, and the future of college football for USC and Oklahoma, and all of these schools that now have giant conferences with fun games. And still it's okay to be excited about all that. It's okay to be excited about being right. It's okay because you thought this was going to happen, you got it right. It's okay to be excited about rivalries renewed between Utah and BYU. It's okay to be excited about all that and still be bummed out for Washington State, Oregon State, Stanford, Cal, non-revenue sport athletes at each of the schools that have to make these giant trips now. You can feel both, right? It's okay to be like, man, that really sucks for that softball play. I'm using softball because the UW players that went viral for this were softball players, but it happens to a lot of sports, right? It's okay to be like, man, that sucks. Those kids signed up thinking one thing, and now by the time they graduate, it's going to be another, and that's tough. That's really, really, like, you can feel that at the same time as you feel excitement for these other football teams to be playing one another. That's totally human and normal. And I don't like how people that are excited about the football thing feel the need to then go get angry at people about the way they feel. Oh, what do you mean this is ruining? Oh, stop complaining about the trips you got to make across for your volleyball team. That's just ridiculous. The reason you have a nice plane for that thing. I don't need all that. It's allowed to suck for some people in that instance and not suck for football because the experiences are dramatically different. And frankly, at the end of it, all of these kids in the entire athletic machine are college kids set up for college experience between the ages of roughly 18 and 22 years old. And what's the NCAA saying? Most of them go pro in something other than sports. This is a part of the college experience. It feels more and more professional, especially with college football. And while that's exciting for a college football fan, you're allowed to be like, man, that does change up their experience too. It does both things. It's okay to feel both things. Anyway, we're going to talk more about the expansions like that and some direct impact on Houston, and maybe some looking at how this impacts other handful of schools as well in Tuesday's episode. Now, depending on when you've heard this episode on Monday, Houston may have already played an exhibition basketball game against an Australia All-Star team. They played at 4 o'clock in the morning Central Time because of the time zones, right? And we're going to try and recap some of that as well. My 8-week-old will determine whether or not I'm awake to watching that or not, I guess, at 4 a.m. So we'll be covering that, more Big 12 expansion. I'd like to talk some about each of the new conference schools, kind of a first glance, looking into this. I mean, we won't see them again. We won't see them until 2024, but still, it's kind of the excitement right now. We have a full 2023 football season that it feels like we're passing right by, so we got to make sure we talk about that and what's going on there. Matthew Golden showing out at camp. Dot Nwankwo showing out at camp. Big reports. I mean, Jack Freeman got nominated for 2 national awards. Big stuff happening in college football this season in the present tense as well. So I got to make sure we talk about that. If you want to talk to me about any of it in the meantime, make sure you find me on all your social media services, Twitter, Instagram, whatever, at Painsworth5. It's PAINSWORTH512 on Twitter, Instagram, and all of your favorite social media handles. Also, remember, if you do hashtag everyday on a question down below in your comment, we'll do our best to answer it. I got one big one from someone named, we'll talk about that one tomorrow. So make sure you hashtag everydayer. If you make it to the end of the episode, I'd like to reward people by answering their questions when I can. So make sure you hashtag everydayer on your question below. We'll try to answer the best we can. Thank you all so much for being Locked On Cougs, your first listen of the day. For a second listen, I'm recommending Locked On Pac-12 because while Spencer is on vacation over at Locked On Pac-12, he did do a very heartfelt episode where he and I might feel a little differently, but I really appreciated his insight and how he went about talking about what's going on with his beloved Pac-12 and what's next. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. Locked On Cougs, the primary Locked On Podcast Network. That means your team every day. Go Cougs.